Welcome, Excellencies and distinguished guests. Bienvenue, Excellences et invités distingués. Quelle joie de vous voir. Welcome to Insights on the Canadian Electoral Process. Perhaps yesterday you participated in the election primer or listened to the French leaders' debate, both very insightful. And today, by request, we offer this webinar where we're honored to hear from two practitioners giving their perspectives. So my name is Darlene McLean. I am the Executive Director of the Christian Embassy of Canada, and my colleagues who are behind the scene, they and I are pleased to offer this event for you today. Our organization is part of a network of 10 Christian embassies around the world that exists to connect you and to facilitate trusted relationships with parliamentary, diplomatic, and business leaders. Whether it's through presentations like this, one-on-one interactions, business tours, or other initiatives, we seek to inspire you with the person and the values of Jesus. We have the distinct pleasure of having a parliamentarian with us today, a current parliamentarian, Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons, Bruce Stanton, who is a member of Parliament for Simcoe North in Ontario. He was first elected in 2006, and since then has been elected 4 more times. He has chosen to retire at the end of this session, which is why he can, in fact, be with us here today. He has served his constituents and this country with excellence, including in his role as Deputy Speaker in the 42nd and the 43rd Parliaments. So that's quite a number of years to be in that very important role in our Parliament. Prior to his service in Parliament, Mr. Stanton was very active and gave leadership in the tourism industry and his own business in the beautiful lake country of Simcoe, as well as nationally. Now I'll introduce our first speaker, Mr. Donison. Mr. Donison hails from British Columbia, where he's done his studies, where he practiced law, and has taught political science courses at university. He was also a political consultant and analyst for more than 20 federal and provincial elections. So he's somebody who really understands the inner workings of elections. And he has also served in a number of political roles in Ottawa and is frequently sought after for his expertise and insights. As you'll discover, he's passionate about politics. And even though he's officially retired, he continues to be involved. So we're delighted. And Mr. Donison, we look forward now to learning from you.
Well, thank you, Darlene, and welcome to all of you. It's a delight to be here and an honor to be here. What I want to talk to you about, of course, is this particular political event the country is now going through, which is called a federal general election. And I think, although some of you, certainly from those countries that were formerly in the British Empire or the Commonwealth now, some of what I'll say will probably be very familiar to you, but for some of you, it may not. And I think it's important in order to understand this election that you've got a sort of an overview or understanding of our overarching political and constitutional system. And that's what I want to deal with, first of all. And the important point to make is that Canada, constitutionally, legally, and politically, it's an historical inheritance from the United Kingdom. Basically, we have the British parliamentary system of government. And in fact, in the document that created the Dominion of Canada, where the British Parliament, acting in its imperial capacity in 1867, united 3 Canadian and British North American Crown colonies to form the Dominion of Canada. Right in the preamble to it, it says that Canada intends to have a constitution, these are key words, similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And what that means legally and politically and constitutionally is a couple of things. First of all, it means, of course, that we are not a republic. Canada is a monarchy. That means that the formal legal power of the state and the executive authority, at least in form, vests in a hereditary monarch. In fact, the head of state for Canada is Her Majesty the Queen. A lot of people think it's the Governor General, but with all due respect, it is not. Her Majesty the Queen is the head of state. And in fact, just to read to you from Section 9 of the Constitution Act 1867, which has not been changed, I think it's important. It simply says the executive government in and over Canada shall continue and is hereby declared to continue to be vested in the Queen. That's what it says. And that's still the case. Now, there is an officer called the Governor General of Canada who is appointed legally by Her Majesty the Queen and has had delegated to her all of the Queen's authority over Canada. So virtually all the powers of the Queen can be exercised in Canada, I'm talking about legally now, by the Governor General. So that's the monarchical structure. And it's important to understand that the Crown has two powers. Like a lot of people, there's what are called statutory powers. That is where Parliament has in fact given to the Crown, the executive, the legal executive, certain powers. But the more important ones, the ones we want to talk about today, are what are called the common law prerogative powers. And these are simply the powers of the English monarchy that go back into the Middle Ages that Parliament has never taken away. And of course, I'm going to talk about one of those very important powers now. But in addition, when it says we're a constitution similar in principle, not only are we monarchical, but we're parliamentary, which means we have deliberative assemblies. And in our particular case, we have a parliament consisting of two houses, very much like the British, a lower house called the House of Commons, and an upper house, which we call the Senate. The senators are appointed, but it is the House of Commons we're going to focus on today. It is, they supposedly elected, it is, chosen by the people. And it is the elective deliberative body. And a general election is all about choosing members to that institution. But in addition, of course, we have the notion, and this is important in terms of these documents, the process I'm going to go through, we have what's known as the doctrine of responsible government. And what that means is, although all these vast legal powers in law vest in the Majesty of the Queen, exercised by the Governor General, by what are called conventions of the Constitution, these are not legal, but they are binding politically. And one of those important rules is the Governor General, in this case, never exercises any power formally unless she has received advice to do so by the person called the Prime Minister of Canada. And it's interesting, our law does not recognize the office of Prime Minister, it gives him a salary. And the responsible government simply means that the person who will be the Prime Minister and who will effectively have power is that person who can lead a political party or groups of parties, it could be, who can command the support of a majority of the elected members of the House of Commons. That is the most important principle of our system. And interestingly not, it is unknown to our law. It is not, it is just a practice that's become historically entrenched. And so not only do we have monarchical government in form, cabinet government, of course, we'll talk about parliamentary, but what that really means, and many political scientists think, we have effectively, by the operations of these legal and conventional rules, prime ministerial government. That's what we really have in Canada. And I want to talk, I'm going to walk you through now an example of that. Is the question is, okay, we're into a federal general election. How did that come about? How does that come about? Well, in Canada, in order for there to be a federal general election, this thing called Parliament, which consists of the House of Commons, the Senate, and Her Majesty the Queen, the Governor General acting for her, has to be ended. It has to be dissolved. And so the first thing that has to happen, there has to be a dissolution of Parliament. And that is not a statutory power. That is what's called a royal prerogative power. And what happens is, back on, well, I guess it was August the 15th, when the Prime Minister Trudeau attended at Rideau Hall to see Her Excellency the Governor General, to have tea. In fact, what happens is the decision to dissolve Parliament is essentially initially a political decision. The Prime Minister at some point, and he can consult whoever he wants. There is no law, there is no precedent, there is no convention. It is the Prime Minister's decision. He would have made a decision that the Parliament needs to be dissolved for a general election. There would have been a communication. We don't know a lot of these things because they're not reported, but someone would have called from the Prime Minister's office to what's called the Secretary of the Governor General to advise her that the Prime Minister is going to do that. And then they would set up the meeting on the Sunday. And there are a series of documents they would have all had to sign to initiate this process. But I can assure you all those documents would have been prepared in advance by the senior officials in the Privy Council office, working with the senior officials of the Governor General. And so Mr. Trudeau would trounce up to Rideau Hall, and that I think usually it was a Sunday morning. But the purpose of it was to give her advice to dissolve Parliament. Now, when the Prime Minister gives formal advice like that, there is a document, and it is called an instrument of advice. It's really just a fancy word for a letter. It's simply a letter signed by the Prime Minister on his letterhead to the Governor General, requesting and advising her to dissolve the Parliament of Canada. That would have been the first document that they would go through, and the Prime Minister would sign that. As a result of that, the Governor General, acting on that formal advice, would then have signed a second document. And that document, and I'm just showing you on the screen the important words that are in it for our purposes. Because remember I said earlier, the dissolution of Parliament is not an act pursuant to what we call a statute. It is prerogative. And that's why at the very top of the document it says, other than statutory authority, which means it is simply royal prerogative, common law power. And then it says proclamation dissolving Parliament. And one of the things that when I go through this, I just love almost the medieval nature of these documents. The language is still going right back almost, Queen Elizabeth I would have recognized a lot of this wording. It's amazing. And it says there, Elizabeth II, and as a Christian, of course, I'm very pleased to see the words, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom, Canada, and our other realms, etc., head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. So this is important. This proclamation that was signed by the Governor General on the advice of the Prime Minister was issued in the Queen's name. The Governor General exercises these powers always in the Queen's name. So the Queen is part of this process, although she did not need to be consulted. And then it says, I love the language, to our beloved and faithful senators of Canada, interesting they mention the Senate first, members elected to serve in the House of Commons of Canada, and to all to whom these presents may in any way concern. And of course, that would be the voters. Then it says later on, it says, whereas we have sought fit, and this is an important word because the Governor General has to make the decision legally. So she's consented, and she says, and by and with the advice of our Prime Minister of Canada to dissolve the present Parliament. And then goes on to say, this is the declaration, now know you that we do for that end publish this our proclamation and do hereby dissolve the present Parliament accordingly. And I love these words, and the senators and the members of the House of Commons are discharged from their meeting and attendance. So the Crown is dissolve Parliament, dissolve the Assembly. So that's the first step, and that would have been a document the Governor General would have signed. So the Prime Minister would have signed the letter of advice or the instrument of advice. She would then sign this document. And then the question is, okay, Parliament's been dissolved. Now, how do we get a new Parliament? Well, that is what the election process is about, at least in terms of electing members to the House of Commons. And so what will happen at this point is there will have been actually a cabinet meeting, because this is not a prerogative power. There's a statute called the Canada Elections Act. It's an act of Parliament, and it governs the election process outside of any of the prerogative powers. And it makes it very clear there that there has to be a decision of cabinet. It says governor and council, which is just fancy legal words for the cabinet, to initiate. And what it is, there's an officer called the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada, who's appointed by Parliament, appointed by the Prime Minister, but approved by Parliament. And this is the next document. So there would have been a minute of the cabinet or an order in council to make the following order directed to the Chief Electoral Officer. So that would have been signed by 4 cabinet ministers. The next document then is this one, the second proclamation the Governor General signs. And of course, you see at the top, it says Canada Elections Act, because it's pursuant to statute. It's not prerogative. It's proclamation issuing the writs. This is the old English tradition. And the wording again, I love the language. Whereas we are desirous to meet our people of Canada as soon as may be and to have their advice in Parliament. So we hereby make known our royal will and pleasure to call a Parliament and do further declare that by and with the advice of our Privy Council for Canada, which is the Cabinet, we, pursuant to cites the sections of the actual Act, direct the Chief Electoral Officer to issue our writs of election in accordance with that Act, which writs to be dated August the 15th, 2021, and to set forth Monday, September 20th, as the date for voting, and to be returnable October 11th. So that's the next proclamation. So that's a direction from the Crown to the Chief Electoral Officer. He will then turn around and issue writs to the 338 returning officers who are the senior Elections Canada officials in each of the 338 constituencies. And I'll talk about those a little later. So the Governor General then signs that. Okay, so Parliament's been dissolved, a general election has been called, and at that point, the Canada Elections Act kicks in, and the chief electoral officer takes over, basically. However, there's then a third step, is that at some point, we have to decide, okay, we elect this new House of Commons, when will Parliament reassemble? And that is the question of summoning a new Parliament. And under the Constitution Act 1867, it actually says under Section 38 that the Governor General has the statutory power to summon Parliament. And so the next document would have been signed as a second instrument of advice from the Prime Minister, advising the Governor General to exercise her statutory power to summon the new Parliament. And then she would have signed the third proclamation, and that's the key wording is in front of you. And you notice at the top it says Constitution Act 1867, that's the source. It's Section 38, proclamation summoning the House of Commons to meet on October 18th, 2021. And I love the language again. It says, whereas we're desirous to meet our people of Canada as soon as may be and to have their advice in Parliament, we do hereby by and with the advice of our Prime Minister, Canada, again mentioned there, pursuant to Section 38 of the Constitution Act, summon and call together the House of Commons to meet at our city of Ottawa, Monday, the 18th of October, then and there to have conference and treaty, I love the language, with the Senate. So that would have been the last document the Governor General would have signed. So Parliament's dissolved on the advice of the Prime Minister. The writs of election are issued through the Chief Electoral Officer at the direction of the Cabinet, and then the new order for the new Parliament is summoned on the advice of the Prime Minister with the initial date set as October 18th. That date may change, but that is the initial date. So those are the key constitutional documents that initiated general election in Canada. And the only reason I went through them with you is because they are illustrative of the structure of our system, which is formal legal power in the Crown or its officer, but always exercised on the advice, essentially, of the Cabinet, or in two of the documents, the Prime Minister of Canada. The other thing I want to mention then is the election itself. And I will talk about one thing. The House of Commons, because we have the British parliamentary system, our electoral system is what is formally called single member plurality, which simply the term we use is first past the post. In other words, there are 338 separate districts, all geographic, and they all elect one single member of parliament. And it's done under what's called the first past the post, which simply means that that candidate who gets at least one more vote, after all the counts are made, of any of the other candidates is the person elected as the member of parliament for that geographic constituency and to take a seat in the House of Commons. So it's quite possible for a member of parliament. I think the lowest number I've ever seen has been 26.5%. If you have enough candidates and enough parties running, all you have to do is get what's called a plurality. So in other words, each constituency, you just have to win, quote unquote, by getting more votes than all of the others. What happens in Canada, of course, our House of Commons, because we're a very regionally diverse country, is we have a census every 10 years. And I'll quickly go through that process. And there's a process of every 10 years based on the new population and the distribution amongst the provinces. There's a redistribution of the seats in the House of Commons, and it occurs every 10 years. We're on the eve of doing the next one. And the chart you're looking at is simply the formula that was used for the almost 10 years ago now, for the current House of Commons. Current House of Commons is 338, and in this election, it will continue to be 338. So the question is, well, how is that determined? Very quickly, the population of the census there will show the population of the provinces, what basically the Chief Electoral Officer, once he's got the formal census numbers from the Statistics Canada, he will simply take the population of each province. And what we'll do is we'll total it, and you actually delete the territories for a moment. So the actual representation of the territories is deleted there. So the total population of all the provinces is then divided by the number of seats that were currently in that parliament. That earlier parliament was 308. So if you had 308 evenly divided electoral districts, you can see there what's called the electoral quotient. It would be 111,166 people in each constituency. He then takes that 111,000 and he divides it into the population, the new population for each of the provinces. Now, the reality, of course, is that some provinces are relatively growing and some are not. So if you look on that column, they would be the fourth column there where it says initial seat allocation. So on a pure representation by population model, the House of Commons should, you can see the numbers there. BC would be 42, Alberta, etc. You notice that Prince Edward Island is only 2, Newfoundland. However, there are other provisions in the Constitution that protect the smaller and the slower growth provinces. There's 2 of them. One is no province can ever have less seats than it had in 1983, I think it is, if you can believe that. That's one. And there's another one, you can't have less MPs than you have senators. So if you go through the next one, you'll see that under our Constitution, New Brunswick's entitled to 10 senators. Now, under the allocation, they would only have 7, but they have to be topped up to the 3 to meet, that's why they have 10. Nova Scotia is 9, they have 10 senators, they get 1 more. I'll mention why they get 1 more after that. Prince Edward Island, of course, gets 2 extra because it has 4 senators. But the other province, and Newfoundland's the same, but all the other provinces, of course, the number of senators they have is far below what their quotient is. So they don't have the senatorial collection allocation protection. There's another clause, though, that also says that you can't have less seats than you had back in the 1980s. So take, for instance, my home province of Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan should only have 10 MPs, but they actually have 14 because they had 14 back in 1983. In other words, they'll always have 14. And so the growing provinces, so the result of all this, I'm doing this very, very quickly, and there's a special formula for Quebec there, you'll see. I can explain that if anybody wants to know. But the bottom line is that the growing provinces keep getting bigger and bigger in terms of seats, but because of the protection. So what that means is every 10 years, the House of Commons is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger because you do it by representation by population, but you're protecting these smaller provinces. And that's kind of a reflection, though, of the nature of Canada, in which we are not just a pure democracy in the sense we have regional representation. And so it's not pure representation by population. It is something less than that. Now what? And that's why the current House and those and so in this election, that final column are the actual total number of MPs to be elected on September 20th for each of those provinces and territories.
We want to make sure we give opportunity to Deputy Speaker Stanton, who, as I say, has won 5 elections, so he sees and knows and understands what it's like on the ground to run an election. So please, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Darlene, and great to listen to Mike, and as he did a fantastic explanation of what has actually transpired behind the scenes here in these last several weeks since Parliament was dissolved earlier in the start of the election campaign, which in this particular case is 36 days. It's the minimum number of days under the Elections Act that an election period can take place, and not uncommon for the government who started the election to look at a minimum period. Tends to favor the incumbent government of the day, but that tends to get into some political ground. I'm going to leave that for what it is. I want to first of all thank you for attending today and for participating in this to get some insights into our election process. I know many of you bring a great knowledge of these processes in your own countries, and it's great to have our opportunity today to shed a little light on how things go here in Canada. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it from a candidate's perspective. Mike's given a really great overview of what happens technically and through legal and conventional aspects of our election process. I'll share what happens for individual candidates in fighting elections in those 338 districts that Mike mentioned. Before I do that, I just want to take the time, as Darlene had mentioned, I'm not offering again as a member of Parliament in this election. So I'm on my exit ramp, you might say. But let me just say, and I know some of you on the call, I've had the great privilege and honor to work with you and meet you on numerous occasions in the past. And I want to say just how much your work and contributions to interparliamentary diplomacy has made for me as an MP. it really does go a long way to enrich the knowledge and the understanding of MPs as to how Canada should present itself to the world. And you have all done an amazing job. You and your staff have done an amazing job in continuing to support MPs this way. So thank you. And I do hope some of us, our paths will cross again in the future. Now, let me get to the topic at hand. For candidates in the riding, like I've had the privilege of doing 5 times since 2006, it's quite a different scenario. It's quite a different landscape that you work in. And it goes back to Mike's key point that really what happens here is that we have 338 districts. We call them ridings. And there's if you will, an individual election in each one of those districts, because it's only the voters in that one district that will have the determination as to which one of those candidates comes out with the highest number of votes. And it's a winner take all. The one with the highest votes gets the whole riding. And of course, the party that he or she is affiliated with gets that seat for that party. And it's only through the results of these 338 individual elections, if you will, that the number of seats are accorded to the particular political parties. And that's how it falls out. We won't know until sometime after election night on the 20th of September what that is going to look like. And we're told in this particular election, because of the health restrictions and the number of potential voters voting by mail or by post, many of those votes are not going to be tallied until perhaps a day or two or more after the election. So in some of those close races, we may not have a determination. And if at the same time, the number of seats that are declared elected between, say, the 2 top parties in this election, if that race is very thin and there's still some results to come in, we may not know right away. We'll see what happens week Monday, but essentially we may not know right away just what that is going to look like. So stay tuned. It'll be exciting and interesting to watch to see how that goes. But for a candidate in the riding, for the background, as I just explained, the focus is all about your own riding, your own district. There's a lot of fascinating and curious things that go on in elections for people who are interested in politics. But we say to them at the local level, for our volunteers and for our campaign teams, we cannot control any of that. The only thing we can do is concentrate on what we need to do here in this riding, because for our team, we need to win our seat for our party. And so we keep our focus there. The way it works here in an election, the local members of a particular political party choose their candidate, usually a number of weeks or months in advance. That candidate starts to do what they must to get out and garner some profile within the local communities in their district. And then they assemble a campaign team they draw on people perhaps in their own network or people who have worked with in the past to run their fundraising and their signs and their get out the vote programs, all of which are elements to help them succeed as a candidate. And it's all done by volunteers. So they draw on these volunteers, put their campaign team together, and then they get going. And once the starting signal goes at the start of the campaign, they're off. Every day of those 36 days, the candidate will be focused on what they need to do. So from 6:30 or 7 in the morning till often 9 or 10 o'clock at night, every day through that period, they're on the phone with their campaign managers. They're outdoor knocking. They may be making some phone calls to key donors to raise funds. A typical campaign will probably raise in the area of anywhere from $75,000 to $125,000 to run an individual district campaign. There's limits in Canada's election laws. I mean, I must say, in Canada, we've done I think a really admirable job in getting, I would say, the big money out of politics. So individual donors are small donations typically to raise all that money. The candidate also goes out and makes sure that he or she is keeping the volunteers engaged and motivated. And that means being with them when you're knocking doors, stopping by the campaign office and trying to keep optimism and keep their spirits up, because from time to time they'll be hearing negative stories and perhaps about their own party, perhaps election news, which continues to come in through the course of an election period. It's easy for your campaign volunteers to sometimes get discouraged or somewhat dismayed at what might be happening. So you as a candidate are sort of the key character in all this, and you have to do everything you can at a personal level to keep people's spirits high and positive and optimistic, and thanking them repeatedly for giving of their time. Imagine this, these are people from all walks of life that will come and they'll give of their time to help a campaign, to help put up signs, to go into the campaign office and phone, do the kinds of things that gets candidates elected. And to that point, I mean, the focus of all of these activities over 36 days is really two things. It's first of all, finding out who your supporters are. You have, as Mike suggested, you have roughly 100,000 voters in a typical election. You as a candidate need to go out and find out which of those are predisposed or likely to support you. And you need to identify them, because as we get a little closer to election day, we want to know who to call and who to connect with to make sure that we get them to the polls, to make sure that they've gone and voted. It's all about, you. From time to time, you will hear political commentators refer to something called a ground game. That really is a vernacular for essentially having a process in place to not only identify who your supporters are, but to also get them out to vote. This coming weekend is the start of what we call advance polls, several days, about a week or so ahead of Election Day, where people can now go to various polling locations in the riding to go in person and vote. And so campaigns this week are going to be putting all their activities into looking at that list and finding out what they need to do exactly to get those people to the polls. So that's a bit of a snapshot of what it really is like for a candidate. You know, much like you need to do once you're elected as an MP, you have a job to do. You're on stage all the time in front of your constituents, in front of your staff, with your parliamentary colleagues. You are a public personality that people watch very closely, and all the things you do, your body language, the way you speak to them, the making sure you don't dismiss anybody or do the kind of things that perhaps might put those relationships off. It's all about encouraging and getting people on your side, to have them with you when they go to the polls, and then thereafter, perhaps when it comes time for re-election. So it's an incredible process, and for us as candidates, it's the essence of how our democracy works. The best person in the field to garner the support they need to win on election day. And then the real work begins. So I'll leave it there, and delighted to speak with you this afternoon. And I know Mike and I both look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stanton, for sharing some of the inside perspective. What did the election results of 2019 indicate about the different concerns across Canada?
Well, I mean, certainly 2019, 2 years ago, around now is when we were in the midst of campaign 2019. And I would say certainly what we didn't have in the picture at that time was all of the consequences of a global pandemic. So there's no doubt that by comparison of the two, the issues around the pandemic, around vaccine, around the recovery path that various parties are pitching as the best way forward in post-pandemic, is the big piece of this particular election. In 2019, I would, summing it up from my perspective, and I certainly invite Mike to add his thoughts on this. In 2019, we were at the end of a majority 4-year mandate for Prime Minister Trudeau. So it was that election happened on time at our 4-year period, which is conventional in our election laws now. So the Prime Minister went to win a second mandate, which he did, of course, with a slightly reduced number of seats, which put him into a minority. But as happens in many of these elections, leadership, the leaders of the parties, play a big hand in enticing votes their way. And so in that particular election, at that time, Andrew Scheer, the leader of the party for the Conservatives, and Jagmeet Singh, his first time and as a leader of the New Democratic Party, were really there trying to ogle votes their way. And as we saw from the results, there was some success there, but not enough to prevent Prime Minister Trudeau from making his way. And I think much of that had to do with the leadership dynamics of the three that I mentioned.
I guess the only thing I'd add is that the results of the 2019 election are kind of illustrative of our single member plurality system. The Conservative Party under Mr. Scheer actually got more votes across the country. So the Conservative Party didn't get a majority, but they got a plurality of the votes. They got more votes than the Liberals. But the Liberals got more seats. And that's because of the vagaries of our first past the post system. For instance, another example I'll give is Alberta. The Conservative Party is extremely is popular there. But what happens in Alberta, all kinds of votes are cast for the Conservative Party. I wouldn't use the term wasted votes, although some of the PR people like to say that. But the point is that in a lot of those constituencies, the Conservative candidate would have won by 50, 60, 70%. All he or she had to win was to get more than the next candidate. And one of the disadvantages of our first past the post system, I'm much in favor of it, it does tend to sometimes accentuate the regional divisions. People think of Alberta, for instance, well, that most people, I'm sure in Ontario, think that everybody in Alberta is a Conservative. Well, no, in fact, I think the Conservatives got something like 55% of the vote in Alberta. So 45% of Albertans actually either voted for the Liberal or the New Democrat or the Greens or whatever. All I'm saying is that this system, so sometimes our first past the post system, because you only have to, get the most votes in these seats, it can distort to some extent the regional differences. But that's just the nature of the country. And that was illustrated in that election. And it relates to something else that Bruce alluded to, and I think we've had a question about too, Darlene, is about how soon can you have elections in Canada? Well, very quickly. Legally, a parliament can last 5 years. After 5 years, it's automatically dissolved. That's never happened since Confederation. So the Governor General has no discretion, just it happens. We have what's called a fixed date election, and I won't get into some detail of that, but except it really, the courts, and there was a court case on it, basically an election can occur as soon as a prime minister might want it. I mean, in terms of the law and our constitution with some limitations. So elections can be quite frequent. But not the normal rule in Canada is we have an election and one party gets a majority. That's the norm. And so normally it'll last 4 years anyway. And so that's how the fixed date election usually works, is you've got a majority parliament and the statute says. But the courts have said that it's not binding on the prime minister, certainly not on the governor general. The governor general can dissolve parliament whenever she sees fit. Obviously, she'd only do so on the advice of her prime minister. So we could have elections periodically. The only one limit is that after 5 years, a parliament count, then we have to have a general election as a matter of law.
I could make one more addition, just a thought on the 2019 election too, that I think is certainly relevant in today's election. It was really the first federal general election where we saw issues around the environment and climate change really become much more front and center. They'd always been there in the past. I mean, that was the fifth election I was in, and yes, they were there. There were questions about it, but that issue never really made it to, if I could say, the top billing. It started to in 2019, and as you've seen in this election cycle, we're seeing it even more. So that's sort of indicative of where the concerns of Canadians are around climate issues. They've seen the clips from the various natural disasters that's compelling a lot of that concern and worry.
Thank you. Appreciate your perspective there. Got some other questions here. One of them is around sort of the purpose, the functioning of a minority government. In many nations, that's not the case. There would instead be coalition governments. Can you make some comment about that?
Generally speaking, at least at the federal level, there's an aversion to the notion of coalition government. I know in Europe, and coalition simply means that you have more than one political party sitting in the cabinet. It's a formal coalition of parties to govern the executive. Generally, the pattern has been if no single party gets a majority, and remember, prior to 1921, we only had basically two parties. So we've only had the issue of minority parliaments since 1921 general election, really, because before that it was just the two major parties. So somebody got a majority. But now with third parties coming in, right, you can split so that no party gets a single majority. And so that means that the prime minister of usually the largest party has to make some sort of arrangements with the leaders and the members of other parties. But there is a halfway house that we've seen, and it's increasing in Canada at the provincial level. There is what's called a confidence and supply agreement. And that is what we had in British Columbia recently. They had it in New Brunswick for a while, and it happened in Ontario in the 80s. This is a situation where it's quite often the largest party will form the government. It'll be a single party cabinet, but they will sign an agreement with one or more of the opposition parties, pledging to introduce certain legislation, in exchange for which the minority party promises not to vote non-confidence in the government for a fixed period of time, so that that minority prime minister can maintain, consistently a majority. But our pattern, mostly at the federal level, is we've had several minority governments, and they've functioned. There are a couple under Mr. Diefenbaker, two under Mr. Pearson, Mr. Harper. So the normal pattern is to go for a single party minority government, and then for the prime minister and his people to try to make arrangements with the other parties, either case by case, bill by bill. And that's what we have in this parliament. That's what we've had in the last parliament. It's not a coalition, but it's not confidence and supply. Although I must say, Mr. Singh almost gave Mr. Trudeau confidence supply by publicly stating that he would never vote non-confidence as long as the COVID continued. So effectively, I think Mr. Trudeau got his de facto confidence and supply agreement. And if I can be critical of Mr. Singh a little bit, Mr. Singh didn't get anything specifically in exchange. Normally in a confidence and supply, there's a deal. The minority parties force the government to bring in some legislation that it may not like, but they want if they're going to continue to vote for them. But our pattern in Canada, provincially, we've had some coalitions. There have been some, but the general pattern is either minority or confidence and supply, not, I think it's nature of our country, the idea of sitting in a cabinet and all the confidentiality that's involved, and you're sitting with people of the other party that you're then going to be fighting in a general election. That hasn't been the Canadian approach.
Yeah.
Now, Bruce may want to add something to that.
I think that's all absolutely spot on, Mike. And all I would say is that what I would say the more informal type of approach to not a coalition, no agreement, that's sort of cut in a back room of some kind. It's really very much out in the open. The government of the day, even though they don't have a majority of votes in the House of Commons to carry their legislation, they really are of the understanding that they're going to have to reach across the aisle to work with at least one dance partner, as some has said. Have at least one party usually has to support the government of the day for them to carry their legislation. This is exactly what Prime Minister Trudeau has done in the last 2 years. Usually the Bloc or NDP. In some cases, the Conservatives have sided with the government of the day to move legislation through. So it depends what the issue is. Mike said, on an issue by issue basis, you can manage. This was exactly the pattern that Prime Minister Harper followed through his minority parliaments in 2006 and in 2008. And you can still be very effective as a government, but you're needing to, work collaboratively with at least one party typically to work your way through a minority like that. The final point here is minority parliaments can be particularly problematic for sitting governments because the committees also have the same proportionality as the House of Commons. So now collectively the opposition parties control the committees of the House of Commons. And we've seen in this past 2 years where that can be very much a thorn in the side of the sitting government. So that's just a dynamic that plays out there in minorities. And one of the reasons why I think parties, if they had their druthers, would much prefer to have a majority government.
Just one thing I was going to add, just to illustrate the emphasis of our executive dominated system. A lot of people forget, I know you know this, Bruce, even when you're a minority prime minister, all of the all the executive power of the crown,
correct,
you don't have to consult the opposition. So if you're prime minister, you get to appoint all the senators.
Everything.
You don't have to consult the opposition unless the opposition make you, and they're not going to vote. So I used to say this to I was working in the Harper government or for them, is that we don't have a majority, but there's a lot of things government can do that doesn't require legislation. The day-to-day governance of the country, and even entering into a treaty, is not, so there are all kinds of executive legal powers that Parliament legally doesn't have to be consulted on. Now, Parliament may hold them to account for it. That's a different issue. And so appointments is the most important one. That's very important for political parties, and the judicial appointments, for instance, all those. Prime Minister simply makes those at his discretion, even in a minority situation, and does not necessarily consult. I'm kind of surprised, actually, that in minority situations, the opposition parties don't make a bigger kerfuffle about that, actually, Bruce. I certainly would if I was in the opposition, but they don't. So prime ministers, once they get the confidence of the chamber, they've got a blank slate with a lot of executive power. Yeah.
Related to that, or perhaps the next step, question just has come in. If the current government is not re-elected, what authority does the government have during the transition period?
We have a practice. It's been a bit of a moving target, actually. It's been evolving. There's a thing called the Caretaker Convention, is the term used. A convention would suggest it's politically binding. The bureaucracy has designed this and expanded. Basically, what it says, and there's a recent statement from the Privy Council office on this, let's particularize it to this election. The moment Mr. Trudeau went to Rideau Hall and got the Governor General to dissolve Parliament, between then and at least until it's clear either that he or some other party has obtained a clear majority, or if not, Parliament has been met and a government has received confidence, it is the position of the bureaucracy that we're in a caretaker, which means that the government can't make, unless they want to consult with the opposition parties, they can't make policy changes. Administration carries on, government carries on, probably no appointments can be made, no major appointments, that's the practice, until it is clear that the particular prime minister either won the election over, with a clear majority, in which case his authority is maintained again, or he faces Parliament and gets the confidence of the House of Commons. We're in a caretaker situation right now. Now, it might be interesting to some of our observers in terms of foreign policy, though. I mean, foreign policy still carries on, but the general practice is, for instance, if there's treaty negotiations going on, they continue, at least by the bureaucrats. But ministers are asked to make very limited decisions, only routine administrative policy matters. But generally speaking, and in the area, for instance, of treaties, the convention suggests that if Canada, for instance, I don't know if we are currently negotiating a particular treaty with a particular country, we would not reach the next stage. In other words, if we're in negotiations, we would not reach agreement. The bureaucrats would stop until the new government or existing government. So we're kind of in a hold. So government is kind of limited out. My friends in the bureaucracy tell me they actually quite like this because it means that, the minister doesn't really have a lot of real authority other than just on routine matters. And so that's where we're at the moment. And it's called the Caretaker Convention. It's been evolving over time.
In a practical sense, I would just say, quite simply, once it's concluded by the government of the day that they did not win, that they didn't get enough seats to make the cut, and that another party got the most seats and will form the government. All of those administrative elements stay in place for the functioning of government, including an ability for the Governor General, I understand, to issue, if, for example, for monetary or financial authorizations, those can continue. So the government can still function, even though it might usually take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks for Parliament to be recalled after an election day. But the government of the day that lost the election, if that was to happen, they really turn their attentions to a very, quite honestly, and I've never been on the inside of that, but as I understand it, a very collegial process of transition where the new government would begin to take those steps to allow for and make the path for a professional transition from one government to the next ministry. And that has seen the new ministers usually being appointed by the new prime minister within several weeks of the election.
Yeah, the point is, though, if, for instance, it's a change of government, just say, for instance, this election, it's clear on election night that the Conservative Party has got the most seats, maybe quite dramatically, but not a majority. This is where we get into the gray zone. Of constitutionality, where Mr. Trudeau may decide to face the House. But if that happened and he decided to resign and let Mr. O'Toole form a government on those numbers, if I'm just speaking hypothetically for him, Mr. O'Toole will still be in a caretaker. until he faced the House and got the confidence of the chamber. As soon as he gets the confidence of the chamber, it could be the throne speech, it could be anything. Once the prime minister gets the confidence of the chamber, he can get a majority of the members of the House of Commons to vote for the government and not against it, then he has all the panoply of power of the state, right, behind him or her. But until that, and that we may be facing that situation, Bruce. I don't know. We'll just see. We'll just see what happens.
Yeah.
Perhaps to clarify again, what happens to Canadian foreign policy during the election campaign itself? We were talking about transition after, but kind of what happens even now in that regard? We're
still in the caretaker. During the election campaign, the foreign policy of the country basically doesn't change in any substantive way. It has to be carried out, but basically Mr. Trudeau and his ministers are not really entitled. This is all by practice, but legally could do it, I suppose, but to make any foreign policy changes. Now, the exception is emergencies. There is a provision in the caretaker, we're in emergency, or if a policy, then sometimes the prime minister would have to consult the leaders of the opposition parties, perhaps. I've never heard of that happening, but that is possible. But we're just basically on hold. So I think our diplomats can understand that the government of Canada is on hold. No new innovations in foreign policy, but no change, right? Just steady as you go until we knew clearly who the new government's going to be.
Functioning continues as much as we saw there, for example, and it literally within the days after the announcement of dissolution of Parliament, the process of dealing with the crisis in Afghanistan continued for several days. Absolutely. Immediately after. So our diplomats, armed forces, all those that were part of that process continued as usual. Certainly, I'm assuming at the direction of the government, but the election process itself did not impede their abilities to do that.
That's right. Yeah, the government continues to have authority to govern, but it's just on a very limited, standby basis, basically. Yeah.
What is the earliest date for the next election after this one?
Well, I mentioned that technically, anytime the Governor General wants to dissolve Parliament. Right. I mean, I'm being a bit flippant, yes. But there's never been a case where you've had it. I don't think you can have a dissolution until at least the new Parliament meets. There's never been a case of that. So a minimal will be that we'll have the election. We'll decide to make up and the chamber will be convened either on that October 18th date or perhaps a little later, but probably certainly before Christmas, and that will happen. It raises a very interesting issue, which we can talk about if you want. What happens let's talk about the current situation. Mr. Trudeau, the Liberals get less votes than the Conservatives. This is important morally, and less seats. But Mr. Trudeau decides to face the House, which he could do. He could do legally and politically, conventionally. And what happens on the very first motion, probably the speech from the throne or a confidence motion, the government's defeated. A very interesting question, the constitutionalist is Mr. Trudeau conventionally, never mind, of course, legally he can he approach the Governor General and say, I just want another general election? And there's some argument that the Governor General, this is a very rare situation, she might have some discretion to say no, or at least to say to Mr. Trudeau, well, I'm entitled to take judicial notice. There's a guy by the name of O'Toole who's in there, and he's got more seats than you. We just had an election. Don't you think at least Parliament is entitled to see maybe Mr. O'Toole should try to, the chance to form a government? And the conventional wisdom, if there's an immediate defeat of the government, normally, at least in Britain, the government would resign in those circumstances and allow the leader of the opposition to try to form, the Governor General would swear in Mr. O'Toole, and then they have to face, of course, you have to go right into Parliament 2 days later, as Bruce will know, and get their confidence, right?
This is what Mike refers to as sort of facing the House. Yes. It really is a test of confidence. The government of the day, the party cannot govern unless they have the confidence of the House. So they have to win that in some kind of test, as Mike lined with regards to the speech from the throne or a first budget of some kind of specific question to the House to gain the support. And it's on that basis that outcomes will fall from there, as it did, you'll recall, in 2008, 2009. There'd just been an election in the fall of 2008. And the government, Harper government, brought its first speech from the throne. And there was an attempt at that time for the opposition parties to try and really invite the Governor General to, in fact, throw out the government of the day, and in fact ask the three of them, the three opposition parties, to form a coalition government. Well, this was quite an interesting political period for Canada, and ultimately resulted in Prime Minister Harper using his prerogative as Prime Minister to prorogue the House and come back later in the next year, in 2009, with a budget. And things from that point on, he was able to gain the confidence of the House. But it was one of those tests of how that process can unfold.
And Bruce, I'm sure you're aware of this. A lot of people don't know that during the prorogation crisis, as it became known, you may recall, it was because of the budget. Everybody was out actually in the scrum, and they moved to routine proceedings. Prior to the announcement of the budget, the opposition parties had agreed on not even a vote to pass the throne speech or the budget. I think it was throne speech.
Yeah.
And actually, while everybody's out in the corridor, Mr. Speaker called routine proceedings, and guess what? The House adopted the speech from the throne.
Yeah.
So I'm told that Mr. Harper used that when he went to see the Governor General. He said, "I actually got the confidence of the chamber."
There you are.
Because, and I think if he hadn't done, and if the opposition, Bruce, you tell me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if they had been on the ball, because it was in routine proceedings, there would have been an agreement. As you know, the parties can agree, we just won't go to a vote. We'll just let it be adopted.
That's right. Yeah.
Any three members, or is it five? Maybe it's five. You know this better than I.
Five. Yeah.
If five Liberals had stood up and said, we want a deferred vote, a recorded division over to the next Monday, I think the Governor General would have been within her rights to have said to Mr. Harper, I'm not going to give you your prorogation.
That's quite
I'm
possible.
not sure I'm not. And the Liberal, I think the opposition lost the ball on that one.
Yeah.
A lot of people aren't aware of that. Well, you were there. You would know what I'm talking about.
Well, that question really, in terms of the speech from the throne, I mean, there is essentially a voice vote, what they call a voice vote. In this particular case, it passed, because that's what House leaders probably had imagined was the process in front of them. And so it just went and passed, because that's the usual convention. But in the meantime, this other side discussion was going on, unbeknownst to the members in the House. So, who said politics in Canada was uninteresting? It truly can be a fascinating set of events, that's for sure.
And that was an example of the other prerogative power of the Crown, which is not only to summon and dissolve, but is to prorogue. That's the other.
Correct. That's another one.
Which is simply a fancy word for adjourning the House for a period of time.
Thank you. There are, as you say, politics in Canada is also exciting, and there's much more that both of you could share. Thank you so much for what you have. We've gained insights into the background of the Canadian electoral process, as well as the current on-the-ground realities from you, Mr. Donison and Mr. Stanton, which gives us a greater appreciation of what's going on right now daily in each of those 338 ridings, where, as you say, there's an election happening in each of them. So we're very grateful to you and for the investment of your time. We want to thank our guests for their participation, and you can check our website, christianembassy.ca, for other resources. Thank you for being with us. Que Dieu vous bénisse, and have a wonderful day.